Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I'd just like to start off by doing a quick sound check. So if you can hear me, then please type sound okay into the live chat. And hopefully, if I get confirmation that the sound is working okay, then we're good to go. So there's a bit of a delay on the stream, so you may have already put it in. Okay, cool. I've got a couple of confirmations come through, so it's definitely transmitting all right. So we'll get straight into it. So let me just change the slide back. Okay, so yeah, we've got quite a lot to get through. This is going to last, the presentation is going to last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So another 45 minutes, or depending on how many questions we get. So I'd just like to start off, for those of you who don't know me, with a little bit about myself. So my name is James Hayton. I'm a former physicist, and for the last 11 years, I've been working as a PhD coach, helping students with academic writing and general project management, with the overall goal of helping them to reduce the stress that they're under. So why is this an important thing, or why are we all here? Well, there's a problem in academia with the way that stress is treated. And so many students, and professional academics for that matter, suffer from overwhelming stress that many people assume that it's either an inevitable or necessary part of the process. So if you want to be an academic, this is just what you have to go through in order to succeed. Now, I remember when I was doing my own PhD and I hit a serious low point, whenever I spoke to people about it, whenever I sought help, everyone would tell me, you know, it's okay, everyone goes through this, just keep going and don't give up. Now, this advice was clearly well-intentioned, but to me, it wasn't really all that helpful. So my situation really wasn't okay. I wasn't okay. And I was pretty sure that if I carried on the way I was going, then I would fail. And it was only when I made significant changes to the way that I worked and the way that I thought about the work that things started to get better. And these changes, they took me from the verge of failure to getting the results I needed for a few publications, writing my entire PhD thesis in just 3 months, passing my viva with 0 corrections, and most importantly, actually enjoying the final months of my PhD when most people are at their most stressed. So I think that a PhD can and should be enjoyable. It shouldn't be something that you have to endure or suffer through. And overwhelming stress isn't something that we should just accept, but it should be seen as a warning signal that something needs to change. Now, we can never eliminate all stress. Some stress is inevitable, and some stress is useful. And part of the point of a PhD is that it's supposed to be a challenge. But how we manage the challenge and how we manage the stress is key. So, what is it we're actually aiming for here, more specifically? So we want to avoid the typical situation where the stress just constantly builds, where you get more and more overloaded over time. And the goal then is just to survive, to get through and get the PhD certificate. What we want to do is to manage the stress, to regulate the stress, a bit like a thermostat. So we give ourselves some difficulty, we give ourselves some challenge, but then when the stress starts getting too high, we need ways to bring it back down again and to regulate. Now, more specifically, we want to be able to think creatively and solve problems as they arise. And we want to be confident in taking risks and coping with setbacks, which are inevitable. We want to be focused and engaged with the work, but not attached to it, or not overly emotionally attached to it. What I mean by not being overly emotionally attached is that you can set yourself a goal and you can go all in to achieve it. But then if things don't go to plan, then you're not crushed by it. You can be frustrated or disappointed, and that's perfectly normal. But we don't want to let it affect our basic well-being or our confidence or our self-esteem. And we want to be able to reset quickly and calmly and find a way forward. And finally, we want to be able to enjoy the work, but also to be able to leave it behind at the end of the day and maintain a happy and healthy work-life balance. Now, this might sound a bit like a fantasy, but why isn't this the norm? Why shouldn't we be happy and confident in our work? Or why shouldn't we at least aim for this as the ideal? Now, if we're going to aim for such a drastically different result, then what we need to do is we need to look at some of the common mistakes that PhD students and academics make and find ways to do it better. So what I'll do in this talk is I'll give you some general principles and approaches, and then obviously we can go into the Q&A and develop those a little bit further. But some of the general principles and approaches, you might find them quite challenging in that they go against your instincts. So as I'm talking, you might think to yourself, yeah, but that won't work in this specific situation. So what I'd like you to do is challenge me. So when we get to the Q&A, give me counter arguments or situations where you think it wouldn't work, and then I'll do my best to modify the principles in response. Okay, so common mistakes that PhD students and academics make. There are quite a few, so I'm going to start with two fairly big ones. Sorry, there's a mistake on the slides there. I'll just go back. There we go. Okay, so mistake number one. Now, the first mistake, which I see all the time, is trying to maximize productivity. Reading as much as possible, producing as much as possible. Sorry, I'm just, where's my slides? Have gone a little bit funny. Skipped ahead there. Technical difficulties. Okay, so as I was saying, the first mistake, which I see all the time, is trying to maximize productivity. Reading as much as possible, producing as much as possible, maximizing your input and your output. So I'll give an example. So when I started my own PhD back in 2003, one of the first things my supervisor asked me to do was write a literature review. And because I didn't really know what was expected of me, I didn't really know where the standard was, and because I wanted to make a good impression, I decided that I was going to write the best literature review that the world had ever seen. And I figured that maybe I could even get it published, which would be an amazing, amazing start. Now, of course, I didn't write the best literature review the world had ever seen, and I very quickly got overwhelmed by the amount of literature that I was trying to cover, and in fact, I never actually finished that literature review. So the problem fundamentally was that there was an enormous mismatch between my immediate ambition, which was as high as I could possibly make it, and my level of skill. So by trying to read as much as I could and trying to produce the best literature review in the world, I didn't give myself the time I needed just to understand the content. So this is mistake number one, which is just trying to maximize all of your goals. Mistake number two is that I went into that literature review trying to show my supervisor how good I already was. Now, with hindsight, what I should have done is I should have acknowledged that I was a beginner. I should have had the humility to simplify my goals and then use that to build a foundation for achieving potentially great things later. So, this is what the Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck distinguishes as the fixed mindset. So that is attaching your self-esteem to showing how good you are, versus the growth mindset, where the focus is more on effort in improvement. So the fixed mindset, this is what lies, or often lies, behind what people call the imposter syndrome, which is essentially the fear of being found out as not good enough. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the fear leads people to hide themselves, to not ask questions for fear of looking stupid, or to not submit work for fear of negative feedback. Now, if you have a fixed mindset, then it's risky to fully invest yourself in an effort, because if it doesn't work out, then it's a personal failure. So what we tend to do is we work harder, we work faster, we work longer hours, but without care and thought. And we stress because everyone else stresses, and that's normal, and then it's not our fault. So what should we do differently? I think we should see the PhD, instead of a validation of how good you are, instead it's a beginner's qualification. So your job isn't to show how good you are, but to learn and to develop your skills. And this means being open and honest about what you don't know. It means seeing others who know more than you as people you can learn from, and people you can ask the stupid questions. And you can ask those questions early while you still have time to learn, instead of hiding away and then being found out potentially in your thesis defense. So, approaching the work with this growth mindset, what practical steps can you take to develop your knowledge and your skills? So, there are two common assumptions here that people make in terms of how to structure your work so that you get better or you improve your skills. The assumptions are, number one, that practice makes perfect, and number two, that you need to constantly push beyond your comfort zone. Right? You need to go beyond what you can already do in order to improve. Now, these two things are kind of, sort of, almost true. There is some element of truth in them, but they can easily lead us back into that temptation to maximize our goals and overload ourselves, which is not sustainable. So I'm going to give you 3 key principles which you can use to help design your work. So number 1 is to vary the difficulty. So instead of constantly pushing at the limit, what you need to do is vary the level of challenge that you give yourself. Sometimes, yes, really challenging yourself, pushing beyond your limit, but you can't do that all the time. More often, you need to focus on the easier things, but try to do them to the best of your ability. So here's an example. So let's say you start weightlifting in order to get stronger. Now you could just try adding a little more weight each time you go to the gym, constantly pushing at that limit. And this will work for a while, and you will get stronger, but then inevitably you'll hit a limit, perhaps even getting weaker and then getting injured. And this is partly because, not only in weightlifting, but in pretty much anything, pushing yourself to the limit, it takes its toll. It's exhausting and it isn't sustainable. And the more weight or the more difficulty you add, the more important the fundamentals of technique become. So when you're at your limit, this is when your techniques, when your fundamentals will start to fall apart. So what you need to do is reduce the weight, reduce the difficulty, reduce the stress that you're under, and focus on the very basics. So in this weightlifting analogy, it will be focusing on position and posture and technique, and only pushing near the limit very occasionally, but with that solid technical foundation. So going back to the example of my first literature review, what I should have done is focus on the fundamentals instead of just trying to read more, adding more literature, adding more weight. And I then could have used that fundamental understanding to read more and read faster, but that would need to come after having developed the fundamentals. But, and here's a really important point that applies to any skill, the fundamentals are not something that you do once and then you move on from. They are something that you need to keep going back to and keep reinforcing. So very often students worry about reading more and adding more and all of these things that they don't know, but they forget to consolidate and strengthen what they already have. So instead of getting really, really good at a limited number of things, they focus on reading more and more about things that they don't know, and ultimately building on a weakened foundation. Now, this is something that the education system kind of inadvertently teaches us through the way that courses are structured. So once you pass the first easy module in a course, you move on to the next, more difficult one. And even if you do very well, scoring, say, 90%, then there's still 10% that you don't know. So you move on to the more difficult module, but you're never expected to go back and learn that last 10%. So even though you've got great grades and you're probably near the top of the class, you're building on a weak foundation. So for a lot of academics, it's only once they start teaching for the first time that they're forced to go back and really learn the stuff that they were supposed to know as an undergraduate. So sometimes working on the fundamentals is really hard, especially if you feel like you should know them. It takes some courage and humility to go back and work on those things. So the temptation might be to just avoid thinking about it. But the very, very best people in every single field, whether it's in academia or any other domain where skill is required, the very, very best engage with that difficulty and they obsess over the mastery of the fundamentals. They're not the best because they know the most difficult techniques or they know the most stuff. Generally speaking, they're the best because they master the basics, and then it's that solid foundation that allows them to do the more difficult stuff. Okay, so the next two principles I'll get through a little bit faster. It's just that first one I think is so important. But the second principle, if you want to improve, is to take risks and make mistakes. Now, a lot of students are quite afraid of making mistakes, possibly because mistakes are often penalized throughout most of the education system. But making mistakes is both essential and it's unavoidable. So if you make mistakes early, if you give yourself the opportunity to make mistakes early, you can correct course. You have time to revise things and do it better. But if you avoid making mistakes, perhaps by over-planning or by constantly going back to the literature to read more, then you miss out on a huge number of opportunities to learn. So I'll come back to what to do in response to mistakes or setbacks in a few minutes. But I just want to quickly mention a third element of improving skill that's often overlooked. And that is to build and use your network. So a lot of people think or assume that the goal of a PhD is to do everything independently. But actually, networking is one of the most important skills that you can learn, and your network is one of the most important resources that you have. So one of the reasons why universities exist is to bring together people with different expertise and to encourage collaboration and the exchange of ideas. Now, a lot of people get stuck in that fixed mindset, thinking, I'm not good enough, or that person will think less of me if I ask a stupid question. But the way to get people interested in you and your work is not to try and show how good you are, because then you just come across as kind of arrogant, but to be interested in other people's work. So find out what other people do. Find out what other people in your research group or your department are working on. Read their papers, even if it doesn't directly apply to your own work, and ask them questions and show interest. Now, by building connections in this way, you effectively multiply your own ability. So you can hear about things that you wouldn't if you were just using search engines to look for papers. So somebody might say, oh, I know you're working on this thing. I've just found this paper. It might be of interest to you. They're only going to do that if you have that connection. Also, because you know what other people do, later on in your research, when perhaps your work touches upon or in some way relies upon one of those other research areas or skills, you know who to reach out to. And because you already have that connection, they're much more likely to help you. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of taking risks and making mistakes. So how do you react, and how should you react when things don't go to plan? Okay, so there are two common responses here when things don't quite go right. Both of these responses, well, they're wrong. They just don't work. So one response is to just keep moving, to stay busy by rushing into the work again, right? Reacting as quickly as possible, or by just switching to work on something else. And that second response is especially common once your research has become a bit more complex and you've got multiple things to work on. So you hit a mistake in one area, ignore that, let's not think about it, let's just work on something else. That way we can stay busy, but ultimately that problem doesn't get solved. The other common response when things go wrong is to disengage from the problem, maybe by checking email, which is easily justifiable because it might be work-related, but it often leads to other online procrastination. And this is what I used to do. So I would tell myself that I'd just quickly check email, I would find some justification, and then while the email was loading, I would open another browser tab to check news headlines, and then I'd get caught in an online chat. And before I knew it, I'd lose 40 minutes, by which time it was nearly lunch, so there's no point starting anything new. So in both cases, whether you just throw yourself back into the work or work on something else, or you avoid the work by going online, the end result is that we miss out on the feedback that the work is giving us. And we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to solve the problem or to learn. So we stay busy, we stay overloaded, but ultimately nothing really gets done. So what I'm going to do is give you 5 steps to follow. So if you've been checking email or Instagram or watching cat videos as I've been speaking, now is the time to focus and write these steps down. And then once you've got those, you can go back to, whatever else you were doing. So step number 1, let me just change the slide here. Okay, step number 1 is simply to stop. So whenever we're under stress or discomfort, what we tend to do is we take the first option that comes to mind. We follow instinct or habit. But if we want to make a conscious reaction, a deliberate reaction, we first need to give ourselves a little bit of time and space to process and think about what has just happened. Now, the most important thing here is to not go online, right? So don't check email, don't pull out your phone. Now, this is easier if you use internet blocking software, which I'll come back to later. But what you might need to do is turn your phone off and step away from the computer, right? So we're not rushing into email, we're not rushing into other work, we're just creating a bit of time and space where we don't have any other incoming information. We can just think about the problem that has arisen. Now, you might feel some discomfort when you do this, and you might also be tempted to engage in other habits to bring that discomfort down. But I think it's important to stay with this discomfort a little while and get used to it and be okay with it. So, you don't want to fill that space by tidying up or cleaning or anything else. You don't want to fill it by going and making coffee. Just give yourself a little bit of time and space where you can do nothing but think. Now, you might need to get outside, so you're somewhere where you're not likely to be disturbed by other people, but we just want to create that space. So step 2 is to just process and think. What has gone wrong and what can you do? Now, there might be some obvious things that you can try to solve the problem, or things that you need to look at in order to understand what has happened. But it's useful to sometimes think beyond the obvious and try to see alternatives. So sometimes we get very stuck on a particular way of doing things. So it's always good to have some kind of backup options. Often, the answer is just to kind of simplify what you're trying to do right now, especially if you've overcomplicated the task. Other times, it might be that you need to stop doing that particular thing completely if it really isn't working. But we want to think through a number of different options before you take action. Okay. Step 3 is to make a decision. Right? So you don't want to just keep creating more ideas, more and more options. Ultimately, you have to decide and then take some action. So you might go with the obvious solution. You might still go with the first thing that came to mind, or you could go with one of the alternatives, but either way, you have to decide. Now, going back to that idea of taking risks, there is always a risk that the decision you make doesn't work out. But if that happens, if you followed step 2 and you've thought through a few different alternatives, then if the decision you make doesn't work out, you can always try one of your backup approaches. Okay, step 4 is to take action, but the way that you take action is really important. So whatever you decide to do, the goal should be to do it with the utmost care and attention. So a lot of people focus on the productivity side of it, getting things done as quickly as they can, kind of related to that idea of maximizing productivity that I talked about earlier. Or they worry far too much about the end result, right? So, this is going to go wrong. What if this doesn't work? But the most important thing is to put your focus on the care and the attention that you put in to the small details of the work. And that way, if you make a mistake, then it's much more obvious where it's gone wrong, and it's much easier to fix. It's also much clearer if the experiment or whatever you're doing just doesn't work, because you know that it isn't just from you being sloppy if you've put that care and attention in. And approaching the work in this way also instills much more pride in the work. It instills pride in the effort, regardless of the result. So our focus is on the process and much less on the outcome. Step 5. The final step is, wherever possible, to see the work through to completion. So especially when you've got a number of different things that you might be working on, you might find a feeling of resistance to finishing a particular task, or a strong temptation to do something else. But leaving things unfinished is a habit that we really want to avoid. So you can't finish a thesis if you can't finish the component parts, if you can't finish the experiments, the data analysis, the writing of individual sections. And you also can't make informed decisions about what to do next if you don't finish prior work. So following things through wherever possible, I think, is a really, really important habit, even if it means fighting through a little bit of that resistance and discomfort. So if you go through these 5 steps on a regular basis, this gives you a way of responding to the minor discomfort of setbacks in your work before it becomes overwhelming. So instead of letting that stress build up and build up and build up, if we go through this process, then you can regulate, and it gives you specific steps to follow. Okay, so before we get into the Q&A, I'd just like to add a few extra habits that you should find helpful. So I mentioned at the very start that one of the things that we're aiming for is to be able to let go of your PhD at the end of the day and maintain a happy and healthy work-life balance. And to do this, it's useful to have a set routine to go through that you repeat every single day. So, number 1 is to stop while you still have something in reserve. So when you've still got a little bit of energy, we want it to be sustainable. We want your efforts to be sustainable over a long time. Now, there may be times when you have a deadline the very next day, so you need to put in a little bit more time, but that isn't sustainable day after day after day. And often people kind of get caught in this trap of thinking, well, I've got some momentum. If I stop now, there's no way that I'm going to be able to go at the same pace tomorrow. And so they keep working till midnight, burn themselves out, and of course the next day they can't work at that same pace, right? Because they're exhausted. So it's always good, whenever possible, to stop while you still have some energy in reserve. Then take 15 minutes, take pen and paper, and write down whatever's on your mind. Write down all of the ideas that you have. Write down all the things that you have to do tomorrow. So instead of having all of that stuff running around in your brain, you put it down on paper, and then you don't have to hold it in your short-term memory. So if you write down all the things that you have to do tomorrow, including any specific times if there's things on at a specific time, and then other things that you can fit around those specific timed events, then you have that list ready for you tomorrow. You don't need to think. And then when you're thinking about what you need to do tomorrow, you can also think about what do you need to prepare now or tonight so that you're ready for those things. So do you need to, if you have a presentation at a conference, do you need to prepare what you're going to wear the very next day, for example? If you do that tonight, it will reduce the stress in the morning because you've already taken care of it, those kind of things. And finally, almost finally, penultimately, decide what your priority is and decide specific tasks that you want to work on. So there might be loads and loads and loads of different options that you could work on, but it's better to focus on 1 or 2 things and do them well than try to do everything. So decide what your priorities are and decide what specific tasks you're going to work on. And this means that you never start the day without knowing what you're going to do, which is very often how people end up drifting. So a lot of people focus on kind of long-term planning, right? The 6-month timeline, the 3-year timeline, but they fail to follow through. And that's often because they fail to follow through on the plans in the short term, and they fail to decide what they're going to do today and tomorrow. So there's no way that you can follow through on a long-term plan if you can't follow through on a short-term plan. So I think it's more important to focus on the short-term, taking stock and planning what you're going to do the next day. So once you've set these priorities, once you've set these tasks, it is absolutely essential to follow through with your intentions. Now, you might again feel some resistance or discomfort, even to doing these little easy things. And you might tell yourself, it's okay, I can put that off, I can do that the next day. But if you do that, then you're training it as a response to resistance in terms of just putting things off. And you also kind of let yourself down, not following through on your promises to yourself. And this can easily eat away at your confidence over time. So it's absolutely essential that we recognize these moments of resistance and engage in those battles and overcome the resistance to doing those tasks that you set yourself. And if you do that for the small things, then the big things become easy. Okay. Final step. My slides keep slipping they keep skipping too far ahead. Okay, step 5, as part of this end of day routine, is to turn off email until the next morning. So this is something that I've started doing relatively recently in the last month or so. It's basically to be able to leave work behind and then block email. So I use an app called Freedom to block email outside of working hours on my phone. And it's massively reduced my stress because I'm no longer checking email when I don't know what to do. Like when I'm in the queue for at the supermarket, for example. I also use another app called Cold Turkey to block other distracting sites on my laptop during the workday. And then in the evening, I set it to block email until the next morning. And again, you might feel some discomfort to turning off email, but I guarantee that it's worth it if you stick with it for a few days. Okay, how are we doing for time? So we've got a little bit ahead of schedule, so I've got some extra tips just to finish off, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So a couple of other general sort of stress management tips. One is to try and get outside and get regular doses of sunlight and nature. So it's really easy to spend all day in front of a screen, hunched over a keyboard, but it means that your eyes never get to see daylight, and that can have huge effects on your general well-being. So if you get outside, get some sunlight into your eyes, get some nature, give yourself and give your eyes a break, and you can literally broaden your perspective instead of having this really, really narrow focus. Another quick tip related to the point about asking questions earlier is to make sure that you speak up if something is wrong or if you're unhappy about something. So, as I said before, a lot of students can end up hiding away, right? They think that, that they're supposed to, be able to do everything independently. They have to show how good they are, but also there's kind of a fear of like, how will somebody react if I bring something up or I make a complaint? And so they just end up taking all this burden upon themselves, and then they don't say anything, and so nothing can get fixed. So if there's something that you're unhappy about in your situation or the support that you're getting, I think it's always a good idea to speak up. And the earlier you do so, the easier it is to fix. If you leave it for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, then even if somebody wants to help you, they can't because it's a little bit too late. Now, that might be difficult to do. There are a lot of introverted people in academia. So you can practice it on a small scale, right? You don't necessarily have to start this by going to the university and saying, I'm not getting enough help from my supervisor. But maybe, there's other little things in your life where you avoid speaking up, for fear of how people will react. So just try it on a small scale on things that are, a little bit less important, but they kind of bother you, right? and then you can gradually practice that and build up. And it's one of the really important things, I think, to managing stress, because if you speak up, then something can get fixed, and you're a little bit less of a kind of victim of circumstance in that sense. And the final tip is just to seek help generally. So a lot of these tips are around, what you can do. But again, you don't have to do all of these things alone. And sometimes, even if you're doing all of the right things, life is just hard. And so there are people who are able to help you with those things. There are therapists, there are counselors. And sometimes the best thing to do is just go and talk to somebody so you can let all that off your chest. If you talk to friends, very often they will just agree with you, right? Or they'll say, oh, it's okay, and they try to, make you see the bright side. But that isn't always helpful. Right? So if you go and see a therapist, they will dig a little bit deeper. They will ask questions. They'll help you see things in a different way. So I went to a therapist towards the end of my PhD, at the point when I was having a bit of a breakdown, and it helped enormously. And more recently, there was a 6-month period where I was going pretty much every week because I was having to deal with some stuff. So it isn't all about you following the right steps. Sometimes you need some help, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with seeking it. So with that said, we'll get into the Q&A. So there are all kinds of different topics, different ways that these principles can be applied. So here's just a list of some of the things that people often ask about. Before we get into that, I would also like to mention that as part of the PhD Academy, we have a whole bunch of courses, including a course that I'm updating at the moment about managing the stress of a PhD, where we go into this on much more detail. We've also got courses on academic writing, working with the literature, time management, formatting your thesis with Microsoft Word. And it works with, we've basically got a monthly membership, so you get access to all the courses. And also I do weekly Q&As with members where you can ask me anything. And we also have a private forum as well, just for members, where you can post questions and get advice that way. So if you like this presentation, if you like what I do, you maybe consider signing up. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about it. There's a link in the description below on YouTube, which you can click. You can get the pricing and all the other details. So with that said, let's get into the Q&A. So if you type your questions into the live chat, and then basically I'll go through in the order in which they're submitted, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time that's available. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to have a quick break. And we'll wait for the first questions to come in. Okay, so first question has come in. For everyone else, please feel free to keep typing. They're starting to come in a little bit faster now. Good. There's always a bit of a delay, so I end up sitting waiting for the first ones to come in. So the first question, I saw your post about writing your thesis in 3 months. Was that 7 days a week, and was it really all of the thesis? It wasn't 7 days a week. It was mainly, Monday to Friday. I would occasionally do some of the stuff on the weekend as well. And yeah, it was all the thesis. I started from a blank page. The important thing, well, there's a few important things. One is that I had done all of the research, right? So it's not like I was figuring out what my research questions were. Sometimes I see people in that situation. If you don't know that kind of fundamental stuff, you're not going to be able to write that quickly. So I'd done all of the experiments. I'd done the bulk of the analysis. There was some extra analysis I did as I was writing, to answer questions that came up as I was writing. But yeah, it was basically Monday to Friday, working most of the day with breaks, and I was doing other things as well. I don't claim that everyone can write that fast. There were particular things about the way that I thought about the writing. I was also bear in mind writing in my native language. Also writing in physics, which generally speaking is a bit more concise and a bit more direct than a lot of other subjects. So if you're in philosophy, for example, it's often a lot more verbose. People write a lot more. Whereas in physics, you can just show the data, say what you think it means, different interpretations, boom, move on to the next thing. So there were a number of things to my advantage. Okay, next one. Can you please say more specific solutions for introverted students? Yeah, I really like this question because, I'm an introvert myself. When people see me in this particular context, because I've done this so many times over 11 years now, people kind of think that I'm more outgoing and confident than I actually am in general life. It's kind of a weird thing. I'm perfectly happy standing in front of a room of 300 students and giving a talk, but if I go into a party where I don't know anybody, I'm kind of shy. So I think it's the introversion. Well, I think we should distinguish between introversion and shyness. So introversion, some people kind of like being on their own. I'm certainly in that category. I love being in the mountains, hiking, running, that kind of thing, with nobody else around. That's like perfect for me. And if there's loads of people around, I find it kind of exhausting, right? So that introversion of being okay in yourself, like on your own, that's one thing, or having that as a preference. Shyness is a different thing. So shyness would be where there's kind of something you really want to say, but you kind of keep it in, right? And you hold all that back. So you want to start a conversation with somebody, but you just don't, right? And that's kind of a stressful thing. And I think the way to overcome it is simply through practice. So taking those small risks, finding ways to introduce yourself to people. Sometimes it can be as simple as going up to somebody and saying, "Hi, my name's James," right? Hold out your hand, and that generally is a conversation starter. Or giving people a compliment. So, "Oh, I like your shoes," or something like that, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter, and overcoming that initial barrier. When you start taking those little risks on a regular basis, it gets easier and easier and easier. And the hardest times are the first times you try it. But you've got to get through that initial discomfort. The other thing I would say, just to reiterate, the point that I made earlier. The way to get people interested in you is to be interested in them, right? So ask people questions, and people like it. People like it when people are interested in them. So just introduce yourself, ask questions. that's the way to go, and do it regularly. Okay, next one. So any tips for post-upgrade slump or last year jitters? Okay, so there's not much context to go with here, and so I don't know exactly what you're experiencing. I think so. I'll divide it into two parts. So instead of and I'll modify your question slightly. So instead of like the post-upgrade slump, you can get a slump at any point, right? It might be you've worked really, really hard to get a publication, and then afterwards you just feel like exhausted and demotivated for whatever reason. To get out of that situation, generally speaking, I think the first step is simply making a decision about, okay, what am I going to do next? And taking some small steps towards doing that. So maybe you have 5 different things that you could work on, right? You just have, if your attention is divided between those 5, you'll never get out of it, right? Because you sit down at your computer, you haven't decided what you're going to work on, you've got no chance. But if you say, right, I've got these 5 things, I'm going to work on this one first. I'm just going to get that step. And then what you have to do is think about, put all of your effort into, just that first step and force yourself through. And once you start, you generally find it's not as difficult as you anticipated. It's really just making a decision about what you're going to do next. Okay. And then the next part. So last year jitters. So in the last year, I've got a blog post on this. So if you go on, I actually need to check to see if I've put it on the new version of the website. Bear with me 1 second, and then I can put a link inside. So I've got a blog post on basically what to do in your final year. Yeah, there we go. So I'll post a link in the chat. Okay, so for the final year, one of the things that needs to change is that as you go through the PhD, generally speaking, you build up more and more things that you could do. And most PhD students have more options than they have time to follow through on. So you have to start to prioritize, what is it you're actually going to do? What is it that's going to go into the thesis? And the earlier you start making those decisions, the less stressful it will be. There will be things that you just don't get to do, right? And when you start excluding things and saying, right, these 3 things are the priority, right? And these other 4 things, okay, that might be for a postdoc or some other later thing. But if you read the blog post, it will go into that in a little bit more detail. If it's, when you mention jitters, just sort of general fear, then I would say probably the most important thing is to show your preliminary work to other people, right? And the worst thing to do is to hide away, right? So seek feedback, show people what you've got, ask them questions, get them to ask you questions, and do the things that you're afraid of. Because if you wait and if you hide away until the thesis defense, then that's going to be super, super stressful. So do the thing that you're afraid of on a small scale, on a regular basis, and you'll find that you'll find that it's probably a little bit less scary. Okay, next one. So how can I get a PhD without IELTS? So I'm guessing in terms of the English language qualification. To be honest, I mean, that will be really difficult. A lot of universities will ask for English qualifications or evidence that you have a very, very high level of English if it's a subject where you will have to write in English. So if you're applying for PhDs and you're being rejected because of that, then what you have to do is get that qualification, you know, and it might delay things for a little while. But if you don't have the language ability, then it's not only about getting in, but will you actually be able to do the work and write about it? One of the things that often, I wouldn't say necessarily surprises me, but something that I often come across is generally speaking, most theses, you know, you have to, or if you want to be an academic, you have to be able to write in English. Everyone knows this. Okay, there are some subjects where that's not the case, but for the majority, you know, if you want your work to be read, you've got to be able to write in English. Everybody knows this. However, people who are not confident in the level of their language, again, tend to hide away. But if you know that that's something that you need to do, and you know that you have to submit a thesis in, say, 3 years, 3 years is a really long time to improve your level of language, right? You can get really good in that time if you invest the time into it. So if you know that that's a problem, then you've got to work on it. So as I said, you know, the people who are the very best, they obsess over those fundamentals and the mistakes and the weaknesses. So you've got to address that problem instead of ignoring it and then hoping that it will go away. So in your case, you know, most likely you would have to get those qualifications that the universities are asking for, and that's the only way to go. Okay. The next one. So I have difficulty with writing. It stops me in my tracks, and I go running to read more and be smarter. Okay, so there are two things kind of coming through in this very short question. One is just the difficulty of writing, and hitting blocks in writing, that happens to absolutely everybody. You will hit difficulties. So I think of writing as kind of a problem-solving exercise. So you've got knowledge and ideas in your head, and you have to communicate those. You've got to find a solution to communicate those effectively, and you have to link those ideas together in a way that someone else can understand. That is difficult, but you know, sometimes easier than other times. So if you're writing and then you hit a difficulty, if your response is to go away and read more, or to write about something else, then you don't have the opportunity to solve that problem. Right? So you've got to slow down, think about it, and make a decision. However, what you're saying is that you're reading more to be smarter. Well, what does that mean? Is it sort of a general feeling of not being good enough? Well, that's a really difficult problem to solve. But if there are specific things that you need to read, right, specific ideas that you can work on in your understanding, then that's something that's achievable. So I'd try to make that worry much, much, much more specific. You know, what is it that you need to look for in the literature? And what sources are appropriate to help you to learn that particular idea or improve your understanding of that particular idea. If you don't know what you're looking for, then you'll just get completely lost and overwhelmed in the literature. So yeah, try and make those weaknesses in your knowledge much more specific. Decide if they're important or not, and then try and identify specific sources to help you to do that. And it's one of the things, you know, the course that we have on academic literature, you know, goes into this in a little bit more detail. But you've got to be specific in what you're looking for the literature. what you're looking for in the literature, because it's too vast otherwise. And there will always be more that you could know or that you could read. So you've got to be specific. Okay. Next one. Okay, so there's quite a few questions. So I'm not sure if we'll get through everything, but we've still got half an hour, so we'll get through as many as I can. Next one. So how can we get rid of imposter syndrome genuinely? Okay. You might not completely get rid of it, right? There might still be that little bit of doubt in your mind, but the important thing is how you act upon it. So you might feel like, I'm not as good as everybody else, or, I'm not as good as these people. But if you just follow that fear and you kind of hide yourself away, then it will be with you forever. And as I said, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. By the end, you won't be good enough because you've hidden away and not asked those questions. So I think the way to address it is to say, you know what? I feel like I really don't know as much as these people. But instead of seeing myself as not being good enough, I'm going to see those other people as people I can learn from. And then you can ask them questions. Now, some people may not want to help you. So you ask somebody else and you find people that you can work with and learn from. And I think that's really, really the only way. So if you're open about what you don't know, then you can't be found out. So, it kind of removes that fear. So again, it's doing the thing that you're afraid of. Revealing yourself, revealing your weaknesses is actually the solution, I think. Okay, next one. How did you get grades from coursework off your mind and focus on things that matters most during your PhD? My PhD didn't really have coursework. There were some modules that we had to do, but it wasn't particularly important. So the bulk of my time was just spent, doing the research. I think if this is in your case, what you're describing, what you have to do is give yourself a singular point of focus in your research work, right? You have to make that decision, right? This is what I'm doing. And again, give it your utmost care and attention and focus on, how carefully you are doing things so you can get absorbed in that task. So it's just, committing yourself to that one singular goal that is in front of you at that time. And then when thoughts come up about coursework or anything else, you can say to yourself, it's okay, I'll deal with that stuff later. Right now, this is the thing that I'm working on. If any of you have done any kind of meditation, usually it starts off, the basic exercises is you focus on the breathing, and when you get distracted, you bring your attention back to the breath. That's all well and good, and it can make you feel nice, but the practical application of that is having a point of focus in terms of what you're actually doing. And then when your mind wanders and you start worrying about the coursework, you bring your attention back to the task. So it's same kind of idea. But you've got to have that particular point of focus. What do you need to do in order to be able to direct your attention in that way? Next one. So I don't work well with deadlines. What can I do to improve this? Also, right now, I'm at a stage where everything is happening all at the same time, and my supervisor keeps asking me for this and that. Okay, so I think probably the thing to do is to raise this issue with your supervisor and say, okay, so of these things that are currently on my list, which is the priority? Which do you want first? Yeah. Again, going back to that issue of speaking up if there's something that concerns you. Sometimes supervisors, they will make suggestions They'll give you a bunch of ideas on what to work on. I don't know necessarily in your case, but they'll just throw out ideas because they're doing a million different things. They have a meeting with you and they just say what comes into their mind. And then you think, there's just more stuff I have to do. So clarifying what's actually required and what's the priority, I think is a good thing. When you do that, I think it's often good to make a suggestion yourself. So let's say there are 5 things which are currently pending that need to be submitted. You can say, at the moment I have these 5 things. I think I should focus on this as a priority and get that to you first. What do you think? So you're making a suggestion, just saying, instead of just saying, what should I do? Generally, supervisors like that because it means you're taking the initiative. In terms of working with deadlines, so I've got another, there's a video that I did on this. Often people set deadlines first without necessarily knowing how long things are going to take, without really understanding what's involved in the task. So often I think deadlines are useful for finishing things, but you shouldn't necessarily put them at the start. So you should just start on the task, get a sense of how complex it is, sometimes redefine and simplify the task, then set a deadline, then make an estimate of how long it will take. So the deadline kind of comes last. But I explain that more in that video. So if you just type in on YouTube James Hayton deadlines, you should be able to find that video where I talk about that in more detail. Okay. So next one, my question is when to stop adding new information to your thesis and start working on what you have. I think this depends on the amount of time you have. So if you have to submit in 6 months, then you don't really have a lot of time to kind of develop completely new ideas. It's largely going to be consolidation of what you have. I think that process should probably start in the final year. You'll have an idea of what you're strongest in, and probably where your strongest results will lie. I think also it will depend on doing analysis of whatever data or evidence you're using, because you can't make that decision unless you've engaged with your own data. So the when, I think it's a constant process of kind of assessing what you want to follow up on and what you're going to drop. But certainly in the final year, that's something that you need to be doing often, is making those decisions. So again, I'll refer back to that blog post that I included in the chat earlier. Okay. Next one. So how do we maximize our focus? Like to deeply bury ourselves in a particular task, understand it, and getting it done. Okay. It can be really difficult, and it will depend on a lot of different things. If you've got a lot of background stress, sometimes your mind will wander to other things going on in your life. But I think it's really just keep coming back to it, again and again and again. So every time you get distracted, bring your attention back. Now that's going to be easier if you're not online. So if you get distracted and you're 2 clicks away from checking email, you've got no chance because you've got all that information flooding in. So very first thing I would suggest would be get hold of some website blocking software, either Cold Turkey or Freedom, and use those so you don't have that easy distraction. And then when you notice your attention drifting, bringing your attention back. But you have to have a really defined point of focus and a really defined task in order to be able to do that. Okay, next one. So at the beginning of the MPhil or PhD, one is told of the upgrade. This is stressful in itself, especially when coupled with the sentence, what is your research question? So what should we watch for? Okay. It depends on the exact upgrade process. Different universities in different countries will have different it will have different requirements for the upgrade. My general advice would be to, obviously you need to have some awareness of the literature and what has already been done around your particular topic, to find some originality. But the thing that is so often overlooked is you need to consider the research techniques that you are going to use, right? And how they will help you to answer the research question. And if possible, practice some of those techniques so that you actually understand how they work. I've seen so many times where people just read and read and read and read and read, but then because they're not considering what they're actually practically going to do in the research, everything's about other people's work and not about their own. So I think, put your attention on the research techniques that are available to you and the kind of research that you want to do. If you are, well, in my case, for example, as an experimental physicist, I was to some extent limited by the equipment that we had available, right? I mean, there were still infinite things that you could do, but, there were certain things, a lot of things that we couldn't do based on the equipment. If you are a social scientist, would you rather talk to people and do interviews, or, go and do like a case study out in the field and do kind of an ethnographic thing? Does that really appeal to you? Or do you prefer statistics? So thinking about the methods that you might use, I think is super important and so often overlooked. And if you get to the upgrade and you don't know practically what you're going to do, then that's a bit of a problem. So that would be, an important thing to focus on, I think. Next one. So my first year will be 100% online, ? Is it okay to do it live far from the university? So if that first part is intended as a question as to whether your first year will be 100% online, I don't know. Check that with your university. And then, is it okay to live far from the university? I think it's doable. However, remember what I said earlier about your network and contact with other people. So if you're far from the university, then that contact is obviously limited and you'll be spending a long time alone. So you need to counteract that in some way and make sure that you have regular contact with other students and other people within your department. And you need to be very proactive in having that contact. If you just do what you're told to do, I think it can be a very hard road. So you've got to be proactive in getting those contacts and asking people questions and engaging with people. Okay. So the next question, I think it's following on from a previous one, saying that makes me even more nervous and I tend to leave it altogether and get stuck in an endless loop of work shirking anxiety or work shirking and feeling like a failure. I'm just going to go back. Okay. Yeah, so this was the question about the deadlines, the deadlines earlier. So I'll refer back to my answer on that. Next one. So I'm pretty much fully on my own with my PhD, with no helpful colleagues and an uninterested supervisor. I'm very overwhelmed because I'm handling everything on my own. How do I deal? I'm reluctant to give a direct answer about exactly what to do, because what I would do if we were talking one-to-one is I would ask about, well, what has actually happened with your supervisor? what have they said? What have you said to them? Because sometimes people make the assumption that a supervisor is uninterested, maybe because you sent an email a few months ago and they didn't reply. And sometimes, I'm not saying this is definitely the case in your case, sometimes it's just that they had 200 emails that day and it kind of slipped through. And then, you make the assumption that they're not interested. Of course, you could be exactly right. Maybe they are uninterested. But I would try again to reach out to them, at least with an update, or try and arrange some kind of meeting. Now, I don't know also what stage of your PhD you are at. Worst case scenario, so let's say the supervisor really doesn't care, isn't interested. I would certainly approach the university and make a complaint, because if you're paying tuition, you should get tuition, right? And to just accept it, I don't think is a particularly good approach. It's very passive, and you'll never get out of that situation. So if you speak up, then you at least have a chance of maybe they assign you to a different supervisor. It might feel risky, but the situation you're already in is sounds like it's not very pleasant. So what can you actually lose? So I think it's important to speak up. I mean, if you want to drop me a message through my website, in the contact form, explain a little bit more about the context, then I can answer a little bit more fully. But I would try, reach out to your supervisor again, and if there's no response or a negative response, then raise the issue with the university, because you should get support. That's what tuition fees are for. Okay, next one. Will you recommend a PhD student to work even on the weekends when things go wrong? Maybe sometimes, but just working more hours is not necessarily the solution. I would ask how you're currently spending your work time before I would suggest working weekends. So how focused are you during an average working day? Do you have email constantly giving you notifications? Do you have a specific point of focus that you're working on? And if not, or if you do have all those distractions and you don't have a single point of focus, then fix that before you work longer hours, because then you're just adding more inefficient working time rather than trying to address your process of what you're doing. Sometimes you do need to put in a few extra hours, or you will need to work at the weekends, but I wouldn't say that as a general response, because you might just end up exhausting yourself and making things worse. Okay. So yeah, I don't think we're not going to get through everything, but we've got another 10 minutes and I'll get through as many as I can. Okay, so the next one is, again, it's related back to the point about the uninterested supervisor, saying also I get horribly plagued by a state of complete paralysis and can't get anything done. Yeah, I mean, it sounds awful. I think, taking a little bit of time out, get outside, get away from the computer, think about what it is that you actually want to get done. Because if you don't have a particular point of focus, or if you haven't made a decision about what you're working on, then you've got no chance. But I'd go back to what I said before. Reach out to your supervisor, reach out to other people for help, and feel free to contact me and give me a little bit more context if necessary. Okay, next one. So anxiety and fear of failure lead to avoid work and escapism. Is this a common phenomenon? Yeah, Yeah, it is. It's really common. But then the thing that you're afraid of is the way you're responding to that is making failure more likely. So if you're afraid of failure and you avoid work, well, do that long enough and failure becomes inevitable, obviously, right? So you've got to be a little bit braver. You've got to say, well, okay, there's a risk that this might not work, and I'm going to do it anyway. And then if it doesn't work, look at why it didn't work. Engage with it. So, right, how did this fail? And those small scale failures that you allow yourself to have, if you can learn from them and engage with them, then that makes it much less likely that you fail on a large scale. I think the worst way to fail is by just not doing it. And just kind of avoiding, and then having that tension of having that intention of working, but then not following through. That's kind of a horrible way to fail. But if you know that you've given it your best shot, then you can live with it, and it's I think it's not so bad. So yeah, you've got to be a little bit braver in facing the work and engaging with it. It's the only way. Okay, next one. So how to prioritize when everything is a priority right at the end, when all the work to do is a race against time. Slow down. It sounds counterintuitive, but if you're rushing everything takes longer and you make more mistakes. So pick one thing, do that, do it carefully, and that's the way to go. Next one. So I've been working on a paper for months and I'm procrastinating reaching out to my supervisor because I'm afraid he will be shocked with my poor progress. How can I get unstuck? Just do it. Just reach out to your supervisor, be open about it, because the alternative is to not contact your supervisor and then feel like, well, I now have to make up for all of this lost time. Whereas if you're open about it, yeah, maybe your supervisor will be shocked. But maybe there are some reasons why. Maybe there's other stuff going on in your life that has, distracted you. And if you're open about it and you just say, look, I'm really sorry, I haven't made the progress I intended. I'm really stuck on this thing. Could we have a meeting to discuss it? At least you're taking some proactive steps instead of hiding away. Hiding and saying nothing is always the worst option. Again, being brave enough to reach out and be honest, I think, is the most important thing. Okay, next one. So Zoom is becoming part of PhD life. Any tips for Zoom-related stress? Thank you again. Yeah, I can certainly relate to that because, most of my working life over the last 10 years has been via Zoom or Skype before that. And being in front of a computer all the time, it is tiring. It can be really exhausting. One way to reduce Zoom fatigue a little bit is to not use webcam and to just speak. It's a small adjustment, but it takes a little bit of the pressure off. You can let your eyes wander. You can, maybe, be on the call with a Bluetooth headset and, stand up and, stretch your legs a little bit, stuff like that. So that would be one thing. I would also suggest, having a clear agenda or a clear purpose for any Zoom meetings. And also, you don't have to necessarily attend everything. If they're big group Zoom meetings, if you're completely burned out and you've got other things to be doing, then you don't necessarily have to always say yes to every Zoom meeting. Okay. Next one. Okay. So I feel so anxious whenever I have to talk to my supervisor. How do I handle it? Okay. In terms of reducing the anxiety, there's a couple of things I'd suggest. One is a really simple breathing exercise. So before you speak to your supervisor, if you feel your heart rate going, then if you do a double inhale and then a long exhale. So you breathe in, fill up your lungs, and then breathe in again, take a little bit more, and then breathe out really, 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 really slowly. And just do that 2 or 3 times, and it will tend to bring the sort of physiological anxiety level down. The next thing I would suggest is a little bit more sort of practical in terms of the meetings, but it's to go into meetings with your own ideas, and suggestions about how you think the research should go, and also if anything is unclear, ask your supervisor to clarify. Sometimes when I speak to people, they come out of these meetings and they say to me, "Oh, I'm not sure if my supervisor meant this or that." So, well, I don't know. Have you asked your supervisor? And I think that's a really important thing to, again, speak up, clarify, rather than sort of hiding away and feeling like you can't ask the question. Okay, next one. So I've been doing a PhD in electronic engineering and physics after doing a master's in physics, and I feel the need to learn electronics more. How do I work on those fundamentals when my supervisors expect results? Okay, so yeah, obviously you need to still do some of the practical work, right? You need to do, whatever experiments, simulations, whatever it is you're doing. And then think about, well, what fundamentals does this actually rely upon, right? So you make it specific to the work that you're doing, and you set aside some time to that. So I'm not suggesting that you delay doing the practical work to spend, 6 months going over undergraduate stuff. But maybe, a couple of hours a week where you pick one particular concept and you really dive into it and you take the time to make sure that you understand it. So it's just balancing your time and making sure that you're, not always just pushing for results. Taking some of the time just to work on fundamentals, right? But not all or the other. So set aside a little bit of time for that fundamentals, rather than replacing the practical work. Okay, and the next one. So sometimes meditation and mindfulness seem like a subtle way of procrastination. Is that inaccurate? Okay, so if you're doing that when you should be working, right? If let's say you're writing something, and then you kind of think, "Oh, I don't feel like doing this," and then instead of say checking email, you say, "Okay, I'll open up the Headspace app and I'll just meditate." If you do that for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe not a big problem. If you go off and you do 40 minutes of meditation and then you're completely spaced out and you can't get back into the work, then that is a problem. What I would suggest is have a scheduled time, a particular time in your routine when you meditate. So for me, I do it first thing in the morning. So I make coffee, then I sit with my coffee and meditate. And I just do 10 minutes. But then what I try to do is apply that those same principles during the work. So as I mentioned before, that idea of bringing your attention back to the breath. When working, what I try and do is bring my attention back to the work, right? So the breath serves as a specific focal point. Well, that could be working on the script for this webinar, right, for example. One thing I'll also do related to the meditation, so one of the things that they talk about is noticing distraction, but without getting caught up in it. When you're working, that distraction might be, say, the temptation to work on something else, the temptation to go online for whatever reason. And one thing you can do, as well as just blocking those websites, is take pen and paper, have it next to your laptop, and note down the time of the distraction. So let's say you start working at 9:30, and then 9:31 you think, I'll just check my emails again. You write that down. So 9:31, tempted to check email. What will probably happen is then you end up writing down 9:32, tempted to check email again. But then those distractions, those internal distractions, become less frequent because we're noticing them instead of following them. And then it becomes easier and easier to bring your attention back to the work. Okay, next one. I'm just going to quickly check to see if anyone else has this room booked after me, and then we can just keep going. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, yeah, nobody's got this room booked, so we'll just keep going until my voice goes. Where was I with the questions? I lost my place now. Okay, there we go. How does one handle difficult supervisors who deliberately waste supervisee time? Ooh, that's quite a claim about what your supervisor is doing. If that's the case, if you believe that, change supervisor. Absolutely, there's no other option, right? If they are deliberately working against you, don't work with them. I change supervisor, change university, quit the PhD if necessary. But it's your, why would you spend several years of your life with somebody who's actively working against you? Again, I would question, are they deliberately wasting your time? Are you sure about that? Is that your interpretation? I don't know. I don't know the situation. But if you genuinely believe that, personally, I would leave. PhD, because you wouldn't get the PhD anyway, because they're deliberately wasting your time. It does sometimes happen. I've heard of cases where a supervisor will try and keep a student around because they're doing, the student's doing some teaching assistant work or admin work, and it's basically like free labor. That unfortunately does happen. I don't know if that's the case in yours, but I personally, I just wouldn't stand for it, and I would leave and do something, go to another university, do something else, because why would you allow yourself to be treated that way? So yeah, it sounds incredibly stressful, but sometimes these situations, they're not resolvable with certain people, and so you just have to get away from them if you're certain that that's the case. Okay, next one. So I'm doing my PhD in a reputable university in Singapore. I'm interested in faculty positions in universities in North America and Europe, or UK and Australia. How should I go about it given the competition? Okay, so this is where your network and your communication with other people becomes super useful. So what most people do when they're applying for jobs is they may either look around on job websites and apply for jobs that are advertised, or maybe send off letters and CVs to different people. Now, most of the people doing that, right, they will either have or be very close to finishing their PhD. They probably have a couple of publications. They might have a really good track record, right? So you're competing against other people who are good at what they do and maybe come from very reputable universities. So how do you stand out? The way to do it is by making contact with other academics, but without asking them for a job. So you just make contact and show interest in what is being done. So if you think about the papers that you've read and the authors that you've come across, who would you be really interested in working with? or who do you know about in the field that you'd be interested in working with? Contact them. Ask them a question about their work. Right? If you do that without expecting anything in return, then later, when you're applying for jobs, right, you've already got that point of contact. And maybe that particular person, if we kind of play the long game, right, maybe you meet them at a conference and you say, hi, I don't know if you remember, I sent you this email, like, and they go, oh yeah, so you've got that, you strengthen that connection. And then maybe when you finish your PhD, you email them, you'll be ahead of all the other applicants. A long, long, long way ahead of all the other applicants, because most people don't do this, you know. So that would be my suggestion: is make contacts throughout your field by being interested in what other people do, and that will pay off in the long run. You know, because you'll have a massive advantage over other people who are applying kind of cold without having that contact. And even if you don't get a job with those people directly, often they will be able to recommend you or tell you about jobs that you otherwise perhaps wouldn't have found. So that would be my suggestion. Okay. Next one. So I'm working on a journal paper. I need to finish to write the dissertation, but sometimes I feel my work has no value in it, and I get frustrated about I can throw it and start again, and I feel disgusted. Okay. Have you had any feedback on it? What do other people think? You know, I'd say show it to other people and see what questions they ask, and try to be a little bit more specific in your criticism. So instead of saying it has no value, well, why not? Maybe it would have no value if it's already been done. Okay, that's then a specific criticism. And then you can think, well, how can I differentiate this from that work that has already been done? How can I build upon prior work? Maybe, you know, the argument isn't clear, right? So maybe you need to spend some more time thinking about it. I don't know what it is, but try to find something that's much more specific than simply it has no value, and then those problems become solvable, you know, with a little bit of thought and effort. Okay. Next one. So what is the process of generating ideas, like to do new analysis or tests during conducting PhD research on a specific topic? There's a few different ways of doing it. I mean, you can do kind of a mind map and just, you know, throw down any idea that you can think of onto paper. But more often your ideas would be inspired by other things that have come before. So when you're looking at the literature, if you know you want to think about you know, analysis or tests, well, what kind of analysis or tests have other people done? Now, and then you can either adapt those or completely modify them. You know, like really change them to do something completely different. But you know, look at what is already out there and use that as a starting point. Also, you know, if you're looking for it's an entirely new project, right? So not as specific as techniques or analysis, but just you know, an entirely new area of research. When you look at the literature, often they will give open questions at the end. You know, maybe some of those you could actually investigate. You know, and you've got to check and see. You know, it depends on when that thing was published and has it been done since. But you know, it's a good place to start. Then from there, you can think about what resources and what techniques are actually available to you and modify it accordingly. But I'd start by just seeing what other people have done, and either borrowing techniques or using that as a starting point to build upon. So next one. So found your channel a while ago. Really valuable content. Thank you, thank you very much. It inspired me to write a couple of PhD related blogs of my own. Cool, excellent. Well, thanks for the kind words, and good luck with the blog. And if you want to send me a link, feel free. Next one. Is it possible to work with other universities who better suit your research interests during your degree in any way? Yeah, collaboration is often possible. And yeah, it happens all the time. I mean, I would speak to your supervisor first. Don't try and instigate a collaboration without your supervisor knowing about it. But yeah, if there's a research group somewhere, very often that happens. And if you look at published papers, often you will see different institutions listed as kind of the home institutions of the different authors. So yeah, absolutely. Next one. So how do we make a beautiful social or online presence as a PhD student? With difficulty, to be honest. It takes a lot of time to build up an online, a big online presence. So, if that's something that appeals to you naturally, right? So for example, if you like making videos or if you like blogging, then by all means do it. But trying to build up, for example, a Twitter following, I mean, I don't think it's really worth the time, because there's so much noise, and it's better to focus on your skills and make real connections with people by contacting them and asking them questions about their research. If you have contact with, say, 5 of the top researchers in your field direct, because you've asked them a question, that is worth more than 20,000 Twitter followers, for sure, like absolutely no doubt. So yeah, I would say if you want to create an online presence, it's just time and consistency, putting out content, just doing it again and again and again. And maybe you build up a following, and maybe you get good at what you do, and then it attracts more and more people. But I think focus on your research skills and your real contacts with real people would be a far better use of your time for most people. Okay, so just a couple more, so we might actually get to finish all of them. So next one, so it's just a comment. So thank you for the line, "Sit with the resistance." It has helped me so much throughout my writing. You're welcome. There's times when just stepping back from it, taking a break is a good thing. So there is some nuance to these things. I think engaging with resistance and engaging with discomfort is the way to think about it. And if there's something that you need to do that you feel an irrational resistance towards, that becomes the most important thing that you can do, and it's really important to fight through it, I think. Okay, next one. So bringing lessons from meditation is such a helpful way to think about dealing with issues. Yeah, I mean, that's the point. That's the point of meditation. It's not about what you do during the 10 minutes when you're sitting on a meditation cushion in the lotus position and, focusing on your breath. It's about how does that help you in your real life? And yeah, try and apply it, during your work and other situations as well. Okay, next one. So any advice for first-year PhD students? Yeah, so I think if I had to pick one thing, it's start practicing practical research techniques as soon as possible. So many people just read and write and read and write and plan and read and write and read and write and then create timelines and then read and write, and they're not doing anything, right? So you can end up with 100 pages of written stuff, but then you ask them, well, okay, what are you going to do? I don't know. Or, okay, so this, when you're putting together your interview questions, what are the things you need to consider? I don't know. And then, but they've written thousands upon thousands of words about other people's research, but they have no idea what they're going to do because they've got no experience. So whatever research techniques you want to use, start doing that. Learn it, make mistakes, engage with it, get practice. That, I think, if I had to give one bit of advice based on the most common mistakes I see, I would say that. Okay, next one. Okay, so this is the last one, because the final one's just a comment. So how did you break up your time reading versus writing during your 3 months writing the thesis? Did you find it helped reading as much as you could through a specific area before you wrote up that section? Okay, key phrase here in your question that I'm going to pick up on is reading as much as you could. I never did that because, it's endless. Right? There were millions of papers on the technique, literally millions of papers, that touched upon the areas that I was doing. So it was reading the right things and focusing on what literature is most important. So my attitude towards reading was, this paper has to be good enough to get into my thesis, instead of, oh, there's more out there, let's gather it all in and stuff it in and find a place for it. So when I was talking about particular ideas, I focused on, well, where did this idea come from? Who invented this? And then what are the best examples of the application of this idea, right? So, I was citing the kind of things that have been cited, hundreds or in some cases thousands of times. So my bibliography was solid, right? I was going for the absolute best papers. When it got a little bit more specialized, I was citing things that were perhaps less well known, but they were really high quality. And I would never read something for the sake of just reading more. And this is, one of the key things that I think meant that I could write so fast. And one of the examiner's comments was that my bibliography was of exceptionally high quality. Nothing about the number. I had about 160 references in my whole thesis. So quite a small number, but they were all absolutely top-notch references. And I'd read them all, and I knew, what I was saying about them. But in terms of how I divided the time, I did things a little bit unusually. So I knew that the internet would be my downfall, because that had always been something that I, when I was stressed, I would, often go online. So I decided I would work from home, so there were fewer distractions with other people instead of working in the office. And I got rid of my internet connection. So there was no way that I could get online to check email. But that also meant that I couldn't access papers. So I had to think in advance about what I actually needed to download and read to write the next section that I was going to work on. So, there was a lot of thinking ahead about, what do I actually need to look for. Now, some of those things I knew, specific papers that I was going to find because I'd found a reference to them in one of the papers that I already had. In other cases, I had to do a little bit of digging. But I would basically cycle into the university and spend, a couple of hours getting the papers I needed, and filtering, okay, these ones look good, these ones don't look relevant, download them onto a USB drive or print them, and then take them home and, read through them before the section. And that worked pretty well. So there's just a follow-up question on this. So in reference to the quality you're talking about now, does that influence your thesis evaluation? Yeah, I mean, if you cite bad literature, it doesn't reflect well on you. So yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think, you know, if you cite really good quality literature, then you show that you can differentiate between good research and bad. You know, so often I see when I'm reading things, sometimes I get the sense that, you know, you've put this in just to show that you've read it, and I'm not sure what you're saying about it, and I'm not even sure what that person is arguing. It's just, this person said this. So, well, you know, how does that fit? In some cases, I've seen people make statements that make no sense, and then they've got a you know, reference, and it's a direct quote, and say, well, that's wrong. Oh, but there's a reference. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. You know, you've got to think about the quality. Okay. Final question, just because it's on the same topic. So 150 references. Would 150 high quality references be sufficient for a PhD in social sciences? Forget the number. Think about quality and think about what you're trying to say. I put in the appropriate references for what I was trying to cover. Yeah, it could have been, you know, 200. It could have been 120. So, like, whenever people ask me this question, I don't care about the number. I care about, are you citing appropriate sources, you know, as and when necessary. Think about that, and, you know, don't worry about the number. Okay. Okay, last one. And then absolutely, definitely the last one, because my voice is starting to go. So can I cite from my own master's work in my PhD? I would say you can mention that your work builds upon that. But if your master's work has not been published and peer reviewed, then, you know, maybe you need some other. It depends why you're citing it. Yeah. Always. It depends on, as I said a moment ago, appropriate references for what you're arguing or claiming. So if you want to say that the PhD work builds upon work that you did in your master's, that's perfectly okay to do. But if that work has not been published, maybe you need to represent it in the thesis, or, you know, repeat some of the work and do it better in the PhD. No, I'm not sure. But I wouldn't necessarily use a master's thesis to make a kind of strong factual claim about something. You know, maybe it needs a bit of reinforcement. Okay, I need to stop. So, thank you so much for asking so many questions. It's the highest compliment is when people are interested enough to ask questions, and that goes back to the point that I was saying before. People generally like being asked questions, and it's the way to, make connections with people. So if anyone has any questions about the PhD Academy membership, you can drop me a message through through my website, or any other follow-up questions at all. I'm gonna stop talking now. I tend to waffle when I'm finishing up, because I don't know how to finish these things. So I'll just say thank you so much for giving up your time to come and listen and ask so many questions, and hopefully see you again next time.